Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Greg Lawson was sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at the plate of food cooling on the table. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the TV his kids were watching in the living room. He ran a hand over his face, still processing the words Vanessa had thrown at him just minutes earlier. "You're a failure, Greg. I deserved better than this." The words echoed in his mind like a broken bell, out of tune and relentless. He never imagined hearing something like that from the woman he'd shared 17 years of marriage with, 2 kids, and countless promises to stick together through good times and bad. Greg was 43 and worked as an operations manager for a logistics company in Portland, Oregon. It was a solid, respectable job that paid the bills and allowed the family to live comfortably in a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. He'd never been the kind of man who dreamed of mansions or sports cars. For Greg, success meant waking up every day knowing his kids had a roof over their heads, food on the table, and a present father. He came home at the same time every night, helped make dinner, attended his kids' games, and spent Sundays on the couch watching football with them. That was happiness to him, or at least it used to be. Vanessa, however, seemed to have changed over the past 2 years. She'd started making sharp comments about his salary, about their 7-year-old car, about the modest vacations they took to campgrounds or nearby towns. Greg tried not to take it personally, thinking it was just a phase, maybe frustration with her own career as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic. But the comments grew more frequent and sharper. She began comparing him to her friends' husbands, men who owned businesses, traveled overseas, and bought expensive gifts. Greg tried talking things through, but Vanessa would either deflect or erupt into arguments that led nowhere. He remembered when they'd first met 20 years ago at a mutual friend's party. Vanessa had been vibrant and full of energy, and Greg had fallen for her instantly. She used to say he was different from other men, that he had something special. In the early years of their marriage, they'd been happy. They lived in a small apartment, barely had money to go out on weekends, but they were together, and that was enough. Or at least Greg had thought it was enough. Over time, especially after the kids were born and responsibilities piled up, Vanessa started to change. She began noticing what others had, constantly comparing herself to other women, wondering why their life wasn't like the couples she saw on social media. That Friday, though, she'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. During dinner, Greg mentioned he'd received a small bonus at work and suggested they use the money to fix the leak in the roof that had been getting worse with the recent rains. Vanessa laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "It's always the same thing. Always thinking small. You'll never be more than this, Greg." He tried to defend himself, saying he was just being responsible, that the house needed repairs. But she kept going, her voice rising. "I look at you and see a man who gave up. You're a failure. I deserved better than this." Then she stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out of the room, leaving Greg alone with the kids, who'd overheard everything from the next room. The kids, 16-year-old Benjamin and 14-year-old Lily, came into the kitchen a few minutes later. Benjamin put a hand on his dad's shoulder. "Dad, don't listen to what she said." Greg tried to smile but couldn't. "It's okay, son. It'll be okay." But he knew it wasn't okay. Something had broken that night, something that might never be fixed. In the days that followed, Vanessa spent more time away from home. She said she was going out with friends, especially with Claire, her best friend. Claire was a 40-year-old divorced woman who lived a few blocks away in a spacious house she'd kept after divorcing her ex-husband, a successful lawyer. Greg had always found her friendly and polite, the kind of person who listened carefully and offered sensible advice. He'd never suspected a thing, but something about those days started bothering him. Vanessa was dressing up too much for casual get-togethers, always giving vague excuses about where she was going and when she'd be back. She'd started locking her phone with a passcode, something she'd never done before. When Greg asked where she'd been, Vanessa would snap back, calling him controlling and paranoid. On Monday, Greg tried to have an honest conversation with her. He waited until the kids went to bed and found her in the living room, scrolling through her phone. "Vanessa, we need to talk. I feel like you're distant, like something's changed between us." She didn't even look up from the screen. "Nothing's changed, Greg. You're just being dramatic." He pressed on. "You called me a failure. That's not something you say unless you mean it." Vanessa finally looked at him, her eyes cold. "I just told the truth. If you can't handle it, that's your problem." Then she stood up and went to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. The following Tuesday, Greg left work early. An important meeting had been cancelled last minute, and he decided to go home to enjoy the free afternoon, maybe try again to talk to Vanessa without the pressure of daily routines. As he drove past the street where Claire lived, he saw Vanessa's car parked in front of her house. Greg slowed down but didn't stop. Maybe she really was just visiting her friend, like she always claimed. But something inside him, an intuition he couldn't ignore, made him park across the street a few yards ahead, where he had a clear view of Claire's front door. He turned off the engine and sat there, feeling ridiculous. What was he doing? Spying on his own wife like some character in a bad movie? But he couldn't leave. Something stronger held him there, a need to know the truth, to confirm or dispel the suspicions that had been growing inside him. Greg checked his watch. 2:00. He'd wait 2 hours. If nothing happened, he'd leave and try to forget this absurd afternoon. The 2 hours dragged by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Greg was about to give up, about to turn the key in the ignition and drive away, when the front door of Claire's house opened. Vanessa stepped out, but not alone. A tall man in a perfectly tailored suit and neatly trimmed gray hair walked her to the car. They talked for a few seconds, smiling, and then the man pulled her into a kiss. It wasn't a quick or casual kiss. It was long and intimate, the kind that left no doubt. Greg's stomach churned, nausea rising in his throat. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone and snapped several photos, the zoom capturing every detail of the moment that shattered everything he'd built over the past 17 years. The man got into a luxury car, a silver German sedan that probably cost more than Greg made in 2 years, and drove off. Vanessa waited a few minutes before getting into her own car and heading in a different direction. Greg sat there, hands still trembling, the phone clenched in his fingers. He wanted to scream, punch something, cry. But all he could do was breathe and try to process what he'd just seen. 20 minutes later, he pulled himself together enough to drive home. He came in through the back door and went straight up to the office on the second floor. He needed a moment to think, to decide what to do. Part of him wanted to confront Vanessa right away, throw the photos in her face and demand answers. But another part, the more calculating side, knew he needed to keep a cool head. He emailed the photos to himself and saved them to a flash drive he hid in a secure spot. Evidence. He'd need it. That night, when Vanessa got home around 7, Greg was waiting for her in the kitchen. He'd made dinner, as he always did, but hadn't touched his food. The kids were in the living room doing homework. Vanessa walked in with a forced smile, the kind she used when she wanted to seem normal. "Hey, honey. How was your day?" Greg didn't answer right away. He picked up his phone, unlocked the screen with steady fingers, and tossed it onto the table, the photos glowing on the bright display. "Who is he?" Greg asked, his voice shaking with restrained anger but firm enough to make it clear there was no escape. Vanessa went pale, the color draining from her face as if someone had opened a faucet. For a few seconds, she stood silent, eyes fixed on the images, mouth slightly open. Then, as if she'd found a way out, she lashed out. "You were following me? That's sick, Greg. Don't you trust me? This is an invasion of privacy." Greg laughed, a bitter laugh that came out like a dry bark. "Trust you? You just walked out of your best friend's house after spending 2 hours locked inside with a man you kissed right out in the open for anyone to see. And you want to talk about trust? Privacy? Vanessa tried to grab the phone, but Greg was quicker. He tucked it into his pocket and crossed his arms, waiting. She realized there was no way out, the evidence was undeniable. Her expression shifted from shock to something harder, colder. Fine, she said, her voice sharp. You want the truth? He values me, Greg. He's got ambition. He makes me feel alive. You'll never be more than a mediocre manager at a company that doesn't even know you exist. Each word hit Greg like a punch, but he kept his composure. How long? For months, she replied without hesitation, as if relieved to finally speak. I met him at a party Claire threw. He's nothing like you. He's got plans, dreams, money. He treats me the way I deserve to be treated. Greg shook his head, feeling the weight of her words but also a strange sense of relief. He'd spent years trying to please a woman who would never be satisfied, who would never see him as enough. Then pack your things and go live that wonderful life you think you deserve, he said, his voice steady, without a hint of hesitation. But don't come back. Not to me, not to this house, not to these kids you just betrayed as much as you betrayed me. Vanessa grabbed her purse, shot Greg one last look of contempt, and slammed the door on her way out. The sound echoed through the house, and Greg stood alone in the kitchen, taking deep breaths to calm his racing heart. He went upstairs to the kids' room, where Benjamin and Lily sat in silence. They'd clearly heard everything. It's okay, Greg said, even though he knew it wasn't. We'll be okay. I promise we'll be okay. 2 days later, on Thursday afternoon, the doorbell rang. Greg was in his office, on the phone with a lawyer discussing the next steps in the divorce. He hung up and went downstairs to answer. When he opened the door, he found Claire standing there. She looked nervous, almost ashamed, her hands clasped in front of her. Greg, I need to tell you something, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. He invited her in and offered coffee, but she politely declined. They sat in the living room, and Claire took a deep breath before starting. I didn't know anything until this week. Vanessa asked me to cover for her a few times over the past few months. She said she needed time alone, that she was stressed about the marriage, that she needed space to think. I believed her. I tried to be a good friend. But then, last Tuesday, I came home early from work. I saw his car parked on my street. I didn't know who he was, but something felt off. I came in through the back door and I saw them, Greg. They were in my living room. She used my house as an alibi, like I was part of it. Greg felt anger rising again but stayed calm. Who is he? Claire hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. His name is Richard Callahan. He owns an investment firm here in Portland. He's got money, lots of it. And he's married, Greg. He has a wife and 3 kids. Vanessa knew that from the start. She told me about it like it was exciting, like some romantic adventure. I ended our friendship that same night. I can't be part of this. I can't look you or your kids in the eye knowing I helped, even unintentionally. Greg stayed silent, processing the information. Richard Callahan. A name to put to the face he'd seen in the photos. Claire leaned forward, her eyes locked on his, filled with what looked like a mix of pity and admiration. I always thought you deserved so much better, Greg. At barbecues, at parties, I saw how you treated Vanessa, how you cared for your kids. You're a good man, a present father. Vanessa never saw that. She always wanted more but never realized she already had everything. In the days that followed, Greg dove into the separation process. He hired an experienced lawyer, a serious 50-year-old man who'd handled dozens of infidelity cases. They built a solid case with the photos, Claire's testimony, and even text messages Greg had recovered from Vanessa's old phone, messages she thought she'd deleted but were saved in the cloud. The texts were explicit, full of Richard's promises about trips they'd take together, about the life they'd have once he'd sorted things out with his wife. Vanessa fought back, hiring an expensive lawyer and claiming she deserved half of everything, including the house Greg had bought before they were married and renovated over the years. She tried to paint Greg as an absent, emotionally distant husband who'd driven her into another man's arms. But the evidence weighed heavily against her. When questioned privately by the judge, the teenagers made it clear they wanted to stay with their father. Benjamin, with the steady voice of a young man coming into his own, told the judge he'd witnessed his mother's constant humiliation of his father and no longer trusted her. Lily, through tears, said she didn't want to live with someone who'd destroyed their family. The divorce took 6 months, 6 months of hearings, negotiations, and sleepless nights where Greg lay awake wondering if he'd done something wrong, if he could have prevented it all. But in the end, the ruling came down. Vanessa lost custody of the kids and was limited to supervised visits every other week. She also lost the house, receiving only a small portion of the assets and minimal alimony. The judge made it clear that her infidelity and use of a friend's home for extramarital affairs demonstrated a lack of character and judgment, qualities essential for child custody. Furious and humiliated, Vanessa moved to Seattle, convinced Richard would follow her so they could finally live the life they'd planned in their messages. She called him, sent texts, even showed up at his office. But reality was cruel and different from what she'd imagined. Richard never intended to leave his wife. To him, Vanessa had just been a convenient distraction, a no-strings-attached fling that made him feel young again. When she showed up in Seattle, he was blunt and almost cruel in his honesty. "I never promised anything beyond what we had. You knew I was married. This was just fun, nothing more." Vanessa ended up alone in a small one-bedroom apartment in Seattle, working as a receptionist at a dental clinic, a job that paid less than half what she'd earned in Portland. The life she thought she deserved, the fancy dinners, the trips, the luxury gifts, all vanished like smoke. She tried reconnecting with her kids, calling every week and sending presents for birthdays and holidays. But Benjamin and Lily were polite yet distant. They never fully forgave her for destroying the family over something so empty. Meanwhile, Greg began rebuilding his life brick by brick. Claire started showing up again, first with excuses about bringing over extra food she'd cooked, then offering to help with the kids when Greg had to work late. Slowly, they began talking more, getting to know each other beyond the superficial interactions of parties and barbecues. Claire was nothing like Vanessa. She appreciated the little things, laughed at silly jokes, and enjoyed quiet nights at home watching old movies. She saw Greg for who he was, without trying to mold him into something he wasn't or couldn't be. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, on a Friday night, Greg and Claire sat on the deck behind the house, sipping wine and talking about everything and nothing. The kids were asleep, the night clear and starry. Claire looked at him and said, almost shyly, "Greg, I know it's still early, that you've been through a lot. But I need to tell you. I like you. For real. Not just as a friend, but as something more." Greg smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't given in a long time. "I like you too, Claire. You've shown me there are still good people in the world, people who value what really matters." They started dating officially, taking things slow, with no rush. Greg's kids immediately approved, saying Claire made them feel welcome and valued in a way their own mother never had. Claire never tried to replace Vanessa or become the mother they already had. Instead, she became a friend, a confidant, someone they could trust. A year later, on a sunny Saturday morning, Greg was in the kitchen making coffee when Claire walked in, still in her pajamas, her hair adorably messy. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her head against his back, and they stood like that for a moment in comfortable silence. "You know I love you, right?" she said, her voice soft as a whisper. Greg turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands. "I know. And I love you too. More than I ever thought I'd be able to love someone again. Claire looked into his eyes, eyes that had seen so much pain and disappointment but now sparkled with something new. You were never a failure, Greg. You were always a fresh start waiting to happen. And I'm so lucky to be here to see it, to be part of it. Greg kissed her, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. He thought of Vanessa, how she'd thrown away something valuable because she couldn't see past appearances, past money and status. He thought of Richard, a man who had everything materially but nothing emotionally, who treated people like disposable objects. And he thought of himself, how he'd almost believed he really was a failure, that he wasn't enough, that he needed to be more to deserve love and respect. But he wasn't a failure. He never was. And now, standing beside someone who truly saw him, who recognized his worth, Greg understood a deep truth: being called a failure by someone who can't recognize real value is actually a kind of freedom. Because only when you shed the weight of someone who doesn't deserve you can you finally become who you were always meant to be. Greg didn't need to be richer, more ambitious, or more impressive. He just needed to be himself, authentic and present. And this time, he was with someone who understood that perfectly. Years passed, and life moved forward in its natural rhythm. Benjamin graduated high school and went to college to study engineering. Lily followed 2 years later, choosing veterinary medicine. Vanessa tried reconnecting with them a few times, especially after realizing her life in Seattle wasn't what she'd imagined. But the kids, though polite, kept their distance. They visited occasionally on holidays more out of obligation than genuine desire. The relationship never returned to what it had been. Trust, once broken in that way, was nearly impossible to rebuild. Vanessa remained alone, working jobs that never satisfied her, living in places that never felt like home. She aged prematurely, the weight of loneliness and regret etching lines on her face that no expensive cream could hide. The life she thought she deserved, the life of luxury and adventure she was sure she'd find with Richard, never came. Because she never understood that what she truly deserved was exactly what she'd thrown away: a good man, a united family, a love that didn't depend on bank balances or imported cars. Greg and Claire married in a small, intimate ceremony 2 years after they started dating. It was in a blooming garden in the spring, with only Greg's kids, a few close friends, and family present. There was no extravagance, no unnecessary luxury. But there was love, laughter, and tears of joy. Benjamin was the best man, and Lily was the maid of honor. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage, everyone laughed, because everyone there knew this union was right, that it was deserved. They kept living in the same house where Greg had raised his kids, driving the same practical cars, taking the same modest trips to mountain campgrounds or nearby coastal towns. But this time, everything felt different. The walls of the house that once echoed with arguments and heavy silences now resonated with laughter and lively conversation. The car that Vanessa had once been ashamed of was now just a vehicle, carrying no emotional weight. The simple trips she'd once considered mediocre were now adventures filled with precious memories. Because this time, Greg was with someone who saw value where Vanessa had only seen failure. Claire recognized the richness in small moments: Sunday breakfasts made together, evening walks in the park after dinner, nights reading side by side on the couch. She valued his presence, the way he listened when she spoke, how he cared about the details of her life. To Claire, Greg wasn't a failure. He was a complete, honorable man, the kind she'd searched for her whole life without even knowing it. Years later, when Greg was in his 50s, sitting on the same deck where he'd shared wine with Claire on that pivotal night, he looked back without anger or bitterness. He felt gratitude for uncovering the truth before more years were wasted, gratitude for finding the courage to move forward when it would have been easier to accept the status quo, gratitude for meeting someone who made him realize he'd always been enough, that he never needed to be more than he was. Vanessa had called him a failure that Friday night that changed everything. But it was Claire who called him a fresh start. And in the end, After all the years, all the pain, and all the joy, it was the fresh start that won out. Because life isn't measured by bank account size or the brand of car in the driveway. It's measured by moments of truth, by the people who stay when everything falls apart, by love that needs no justification or explanation. Greg learned that being called a failure by someone who can't recognize worth isn't a sentence, it's a liberation. And true fresh starts don't come from grand gestures or radical changes, but from small, brave choices, the choice to get back up after falling, the choice to believe you deserve more, the choice to open your heart again even after it's been broken. And so, under Portland's starry sky, with Claire by his side and the certainty that he'd found his place in the world, Greg finally understood it was never about being enough for Vanessa. It was about being enough for himself. And in the end, he always was. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.